So I think Bonhoeffer's words make a great introduction, because there was a reason that nobody spoke out. It has a name, and we know it very well today. It's called political correctness.
That's right.
Now, when it comes to political correctness, there's probably no topic that's more subject to it right now than Islam. I'll ask you a question. Can a faithful Muslim be a good American citizen?
No.
Is that possible?
No.
Well, can a communist be a good American citizen? Can a Nazi be a good American citizen? I know that at first this is going to seem like a stretch, like an unrealistic parallel. So what I want to do is I want to go through the terminology of Islam, and in doing that, I want to try to bring you to, maybe you already have this, but I want to make sure everyone has a full understanding of what the Islamic mindset is, of what the Quran teaches, of what Muhammad taught and did, and of the subtleties that make it possible for the religion of Islam to cause us to focus on that superficial part of what is really a much deeper phenomenon historically and today. The first term that I want to address with you is Islam itself. Islam means peace, right? Translated from Arabic. Anybody think otherwise?
Yes.
Islam means submission. Submission to Allah. And I'm not going to use the pronunciations. I'm sure you've all heard people say in the same sentence, Nicaragua and Mexico. Why don't they say Mexico? Political correctness. They're appealing to the crowd that favored the Sandinistas back in the revolutionary time in Nicaragua. And so they use the pronunciation that was favored by that group. And when it comes to Islam, you'll see that the apologists for Islam are very strong on using Islam and Muslim and all these vanities of pronunciation to try to show that they're part of, that they're sympathetic with the other movement. So I'm not going to do that. So in speaking of Islam, I'll just give you a couple of points on Islam and then move on to some other terms. First of all, you must understand that Islam as a code of conduct doesn't bind Muslims in their dealings with non-Muslims. The rules are within Muslim. Try to visualize it this way. It's a pirate code. Islam is based on plunder, and it's based on plunder with a set of a code of conduct for the members. When we take the ship, there are certain things that we do and don't do. We have a set of rules for how we divide the spoils. We have rules for what we do with the women, and we keep these rules between ourselves. But when it comes to dealing with infidels, any infidels in this room? When it comes to dealing with infidels, there's a whole different set of rules. You have to remember, I was going to save addressing Muhammad himself, but I'll just make a couple of points that people don't often appreciate. Muhammad was a pirate. Okay, he was born in the Arabian desert in 570. He had an uneventful early life, and then he met a rich woman who owned a caravan, and he went to work for her. And he was successful and ended up marrying her. And then he started to have visions. He was epileptic, and he went into trances, and he often went off to a cave outside of Mecca because it was cool. And he would have trances, and the angel Gabriel came to him and started dictating the word of Allah, directly to him. And he began to work to persuade his immediate relatives and friends that he was the prophet of God. And then he almost immediately went to war with the Arabs living around him, including his own tribe. And when they wouldn't be persuaded, and they drove him out, and he fled from Mecca to Medina. That's the famous Hijra. That's what the basis of the Muslim pilgrimage is. And as soon as he could grow a larger following, he began to attack his own tribe, and then other Arab tribes, and then the Jews of Arabia, and the religion spread from there. But in his life, he led 55 campaigns, most of which I think 55 is the right number. He organized approximately another 70 military campaigns, but these were mostly raids against caravans, and they were all about plunder. And during the course of this, he received continuing dictates from Allah about how to conduct this, what was permissible, what was impermissible. Can you lie? Can you enter treaties and then break them? What is the punishment for apostasy? What is the punishment for someone who refuses to convert? And so this is the backdrop. I'll return to Muhammad if I have time and go into more detail. But Islam is the code of conduct for this regime of piracy and plunder. As such, it's inherently expansive. The mandate for all Muslims is to spread Islam to the whole world. Now, there's nothing in Islam that says to do that by example or by peaceful preaching or any of the kinds of things that Westerners, and particularly Christians, imagine the rules for spreading a religion to be. When, for example, Christianity spread to the ancient world, almost without exception, it did so by conversion. By the time of the Crusades in 1096, 2/3 of the Christian world had been occupied by Islam, and in every single case it was by the sword. So we're looking at a totally different phenomenon historically and in terms of the present day. And right now, we are so bound up in our own political correctness that we're afraid to see the reality. An example that was so striking and so shocking was the treatment of Osama bin Laden after he was killed. A washing, an Islamic funeral, the funeral message translated into Arabic, so that we could make sure that we don't inflame what people? Who are these people that we're afraid to inflame? I thought Islam was a religion of peace. I thought most Muslims were peaceful and wanted to get along. Why is it that we have to bend over backwards to dignify a mass murderer so that we won't anger Islam? There's something wrong here. We're looking at this backwards. Imagine if they would have taken Hitler, which unfortunately they didn't find his body, but imagine if they would have gone through that with him. Or imagine at the end of World War II in the Nuremberg trials and the prosecution of the Japanese. What if they would have gone to great extents to make sympathetic remarks at a funeral, sympathetic remarks about the Nazi movement, and said, "Now we don't want to offend it. We know there's still Nazis left. We don't want to offend any of these people." You know, we would laugh that to scorn. It would seem ridiculous, but we've reached the point where it seems reasonable to us that we don't want to offend these people. We should be, we're at war with them, and we should be acting in that way. Now, for Islam, there is a sense in which it is a religion of peace, and that is that when all the world has once submitted, then they believe there will be peace. Allah. How many think that Allah and the Christian God are the same being? Nobody's taking any chances here. Wow. I didn't think they were either. From my studies, Allah is an extremely cruel, extremely uncaring God, an extremely demanding God who has no real compassion. But I was doing some reading on it, and the rationale for why Christianity accepts Islam as worshiping the same God is because the beginning of the Islamic belief was based on Judaism and Christianity, and Muhammad thought that the God that he called Allah was the same God as the God of Abraham and Isaac. But the way that Muslims perceive that God is so different from Christianity. Are you all familiar with the story of the blind man and the elephant? And
Yeah.
They called on a group of blind men to examine an elephant, and one reached out and felt his leg and said, "It's a tree, a palm tree." And another felt his side and said, "It's a wall." And another grabbed the tail and said, "Oh, it's a rope." And when they were all done, it turned out that the one that grabbed the tail was a Muslim. In other words, your perceptions of God are very different, and the Muslims have a very distorted view of Allah, of God. For example, Allah has no son. There was no redeeming sacrifice. There's no Holy Spirit. Jesus was just a prophet and not even a really significant prophet. Allah doesn't look for love, and he doesn't give love. What Allah wants is unquestioning submission. Allah predestines everything, and this is hard to grasp when we talk about how Allah predestines it. So I'll use an example of how Islam came to science. When the Enlightenment came to Europe and the Western world surged ahead and Islam went into decline, one of the reasons was because Islam could not understand the principles of science. Because if I conduct an experiment and electricity surges out of a motor that I created, and I say, wow, nature has laws, and if I do certain things, I can get this result. Islam said, no, Allah willed it. And it's not for us to question why every time you turn that handle, a spark comes out over here. But Allah's doing it. And that's an important difference, because it's how they look at everything that happens in the world. Allah willed it. It's predestined. It doesn't mean that they don't try to help, but it means with what they think is Allah's plan, but it means that conceptually they aren't really able to see man as having free will in a nature that has its own laws. Now, what does Allah want for infidels? There's only two choices.
Yeah.
He either wants them to convert to Islam, or he wants them to suffer horrible torment in this world and then burn in hell forever for not believing in Islam. Now, I'm sure you all know basically what the Quran is, and I touched on it. It's the Word of God, direct verbatim, delivered by the angel Gabriel to Muhammad. The first part of the Quran was delivered to Muhammad in a cave near Mecca. And it was at a time when Muhammad was having a very difficult time getting a following. And he was under threat from the Arab tribes around him who had very different beliefs. They believed in many gods. And so he had lots of passages in there about there should be tolerance in religion, and passages about peaceful conduct and getting along with your neighbors and those kinds of things. And most of you have heard some of those quoted probably. I didn't come here to quote surahs today because it would just take too long. But that was the gist of those early passages from the Quran. Later on, when Muhammad moved to Medina and grew a large following and began to have military victories, then all of a sudden, Allah started telling him very different things. Then he started saying, kill the infidel, strike them in the neck. You can't ever befriend an infidel except in order to deceive him, and those kinds of things. So we've got people on one side quoting the Quran saying one kind of thing, and people on the Islamic side quoting the Quran to say a completely different kind of thing. And most Westerners don't know how to differentiate between those two. I will return to that. I talked briefly about the Hijra. It was in 622. Muhammad was about 50, and he fled, well, I think it's a roughly 150-mile trip across the desert.